Hello, and welcome back to another Half Pint session. Cheers. Today we have joining us someone who was at the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis conference, which Andrew and I attended recently. And he had written a paper about C.S. Lewis and Edmund Spenser. And those of you that follow the audio podcast will know that we actually had a session on Spenser specifically last season. So that's season 7, episode 24. So this was a talk I really wanted to go to, but then Ruth Jackson from the C.S. Lewis podcast asked me to record another session, so I didn't get to go to it. So I thought I'd bring him onto the show and tell us all about it. Dr. Josh Herring, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, David. It was great to meet you in Portland, and I've since become a big fan of your show. I didn't know about your show until I saw your table. I know, I feel like a heretic being a Lewis fan, but not knowing about Pints with Jack. But then I saw your table there and got to meet you and reconnected with Andrew. We had met previously, but and then I'm loving what you guys are doing with the Paralandra season. It's absolutely fantastic.
It's a lot of fun, and I read Paralandra quite a few years ago, but I just sort of gulped it down. And so I always say with Lewis, he always merits reading slowly and reading in community. And it's a very different experience being able to go through this thing now, just chapter by chapter, bit by bit, and really chewing on some of the ideas that he's drawing out there.
For sure.
Well, when I lifted up my beer a little earlier, I saw that you actually have something as well. What are you drinking?
So I love Smoke Wagon bourbon. That's my favorite bourbon. I'll try and put that a bit more center into the screen so you can see it. But they're out of Las Vegas, Nevada, and it's always a treat when they make it all the way out here to North Carolina. So I picked up some Smoke Wagon. I figured should have something interesting for the show.
Quite right. Well done. Well done. Yes. I haven't drunk too much bourbon. I was giving some talks in Dodge City, Kansas, and the guy that brought me out, he was a real bourbon drinker, and his thing was trying to find cheap, good bourbons. And I was amazed at what I tasted, because I've always been a Scotch guy, and bourbon I've always found a little bit aggressive, but he had some lovely stuff. So I'll have to try and check that one out. Hopefully they export to Wisconsin.
Hopefully so. And I'm by no means a bourbon aficionado. I've met some bourbon drinkers who they have this encyclopedic knowledge. I'm very much a novice, but I do enjoy a good glass of bourbon every now and again.
Beautiful. Well, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit to our viewers?
Sure. So, as you've already mentioned, my name is Josh Herring. I am a professor of classical education and humanities at Thales College in Wake Forest, North Carolina. I've been thinking about C.S. Lewis for a long time, but he became a particular fascination when I was looking for a dissertation topic. And I ended up settling on trying to untangle what exactly Lewis is doing with gender, primarily in Paralandra, but then also in That Hideous Strength.
Oh, you're coming back on this show. Oh, I have lots of questions. Okay, sorry. Please continue.
Excellent. Yes. Well, you can probably already tell that I'm really looking forward to the conversation that you and your co-host keep hinting at about when you're going to talk about the cool, trippy 10 pages at the end of the book. But can't do spoilers, I know. But the part of what got me intrigued with the Undiscovered Lewis conference was that my dissertation was advised by a gentleman named Dr. Ben Lockard, and he's a Spenserian. We had actually gotten connected over my desire to read Edmund Spenser, but not having any knowledge about how to do that or how to get into Spenser, and then discovering that Dr. Lockard was a world-renowned scholar of Edmund Spenser. So we set up a tutorial, and the part of what I ended up tracing that really, at least Dr. Lockard thinks, is the unique contribution to Lewis scholarship that the dissertation makes is really the connection between Lewis and Spenser. So that's part of what I've been really just fascinated by trying to track and see if anybody else has explored that. And a couple of people have, but as one does when writing a dissertation, I tried to figure out how I was how I was right and they were wrong, basically. And that's just part of the game. But my day job is teaching humanities classes and reading old books with students. And I find that in almost every class, there's something Lewis has written that becomes particularly relevant to that discussion, whether it's the Abolition of Man, or whether it's just a scene from the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, or whether it's his essay on chivalry. There's always something from Lewis that's particularly relevant.
How did you begin, Lewis? Was it childhood in Narnia, or did you take a different route?
Really, it was childhood. So I was homeschooled in the early 90s, and I really have two ladies to thank for my connection with Lewis. It's first my mom, but then it's also her friend Michelle. My mom is a deep lover of ideas, but she does not love fiction. And so she taught me how to read, and I read my first sentence at somewhere around age 4 or 5, and she promptly pulled out the prize, and she sat down a 7-volume set of the Chronicles of Narnia. And she had gotten those because her friend Michelle had told her, oh, the Chronicles of Narnia are the best books. This is what you should get your son who is going to be a reader. Well, I just devoured those books. And from age 5 to 25, I probably read through Narnia, I don't know, 20, 25 times. I mean, just they were the books that I kept coming back to over and over and over again. There was something about the characters, about the world, about the ideas. When I got into seminary, I really was focused on I got kind of fascinated by the question of what's actually the best way to teach theology. Okay. And I was surrounded by theology eggheads who believed that basically, even though we were all Baptist, I was surrounded by a bunch of scholastics. They would not recognize that they were scholastics, but they would have been right at home with Aquinas and his, I object, but my reply won to your contention won. And I'm over here thinking, honestly, I got 3/4 of what I know about theology comes from C.S. Lewis and from his stories. And as I got older and I got into teaching, I developed a much greater appreciation for his essays. And they kept speaking to me in different ways. But really, that's at least how I got into it. It all started with Narnia. I don't even remember where I encountered. I called it the Space Trilogy then. I would call it the Ransom Trilogy now. Michael Ward has corrected my pronunciation of the title there.
He corrects a lot of people.
Yep. That's where it started. It was Narnia, and just fell in love with those stories.
Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, we've had an episode on Spenser in the Jack's Bookshelf series. So we're just trying to look at the books that shaped him. So we've got some material there that people are going to listen to if they'd like to know more. But can you just give us like a potted history of Spenser's life and work?
I will try. I will confess. I'm afraid I know his work a little bit better than I know his life. But he is a 16th century poet, and he spent some time in Ireland. He also spent time in the court of Queen Elizabeth. He was friends with Sir Walter Raleigh. So he has so I'll do a little show and tell here. At the back of my edition of Spenser is his copy of the letter to Raleigh. He lived through some of the tumultuous years right before Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. So just for your listeners' sake, I'm sure everybody remembers King Henry VIII and his 6 wives, divorced, beheaded, and died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Right after Henry's demise, it was a very unstable time for the British throne, or the English throne. But eventually, Queen Elizabeth is the one who becomes the stable monarch, and she really is. And she's particularly significant because she's a Protestant monarch, and she's trying to lead the Church of England to be sort of that via media or via media, depending on your stance on Latin.
Oh, sorry, one moment. It just said you stopped recording.
Yeah.
So I've started recording again. Maybe take it from she was really trying to be the via or via media. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Ulysses Benevidici. Yep. He did not say Benevidici. That no.
No, I know. I hear. I can't really do the V's as W's, but when I got into teaching, I was surrounded by folks who did classical Latin. They didn't do any ecclesial Latin. Anyway, it's a whole thing. So Elizabeth is trying to carve out this middle way where the Church of England is neither excessively Catholic, nor is it rejecting all of the smells and bells of the Catholic tradition. And in that context, Edmund Spenser becomes he rises as one of the best poets of his generation. And he does some early poetry. He has a collection that's often called the Shepherd's Cycle. He publishes a series of poems that are all thematically arranged around the calendar, and then those are sort of his pastoral poems. When I did that class I mentioned with Dr. Lockard, he insisted that I read through those, and they were fine. They're nothing terribly exciting. They're kind of maybe analogous to reading some of Milton's early stuff. You can tell that it's very good, but he's clearly not yet hit his magnum opus. Towards the end of his relatively short life, he died pretty young. Spenser started working on the Faerie Queene, and he wrote early in those years. He wrote this letter to Sir Walter Raleigh where he talks about his reasoning for the Faerie Queene. This is supposed to be a giant display of the Aristotelian virtues. And as such, it's going to have a certain number of books, and each book is going to be organized around one of those virtues. Well, the problem is that he says that, and I found this to be an early problem in hermeneutics. What do you do when the author actually is not a great person to explain his work to you? Because Spenser dies, and it's a great matter of literary historical argument as to whether or not his book is complete in 6 books, or whether he died with his work incomplete. Because he writes 5 books that are clearly set, each one around an allegorical display of a virtue, set in this particular, his iteration of fairy. But then he has book 6 be a complete break from his previous plan, and book 6 is all about mutability and change. And there is a camp of scholars who say, this was always the plan. He was headed for mutability and the instability of life being our running theme. But there's also scholars who think, yep, he died with it incomplete. This is book 6 of 12. and there's a lot of debate about that. So that's as much as I'm aware of about his particular life. But he kind of stands out as a preeminently Protestant poet who is trying to celebrate his queen. The focal point of all of the Faerie Queene is the search for Gloriana, who is clearly Elizabeth I.
Well, so now we come to the topic then of your paper at the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis conference. What did you talk about? What did I miss? In one sense, quite a bit. So I'm going to attempt to just summarize that. I won't bore your audience with attempting to read a paper on your show. So I started with trying to outline the fact that this is clearly an area that people who love Lewis need to pay attention to. Because it's certainly true that there are a lot of folks who love Lewis. There are very few people who love Spenser in today's world. And that's I think, eminently justifiable, because Spenser's hard. He's really complicated. We can get into some of that in a bit if you want, but he's tricky. But when you read Lewis's literary criticism, it's impossible to escape just how much Lewis loves Spenser. He spends a chapter in Allegory of Love on Spenser. He dedicates another chapter in the Oh Hell volume to Spenser. He manages to work references to Spenser throughout his different essays. He did a course at I don't remember if it was Oxford or Cambridge, but he did a formal course of lectures on the Faerie Queene. He did not publish those lectures, but one of his students did posthumously. Those are published as Spenser's Images of Life. Lewis loved this poem, but particularly he's always writing about the Faerie Queene. He doesn't have a lot to say about Spenser's other works. It's really the Faerie Queene. So that's part of where I started, was just to kind of lay out the fact, like, if you're really a diehard Lewis fan, then it should matter that Lewis valued Spenser this highly. There's a lot of authors that he could have praised. He spends so much time on Spenser. Particularly one line that always stands out to me is that he calls, in the Allegory of Love, Lewis calls the Faerie Queene Spenser's hymn to life. And he even goes so far as to say that reading Spenser
is good medicine for mental illness.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly high praise. I got stuck trying to figure out what exactly is going on with that. Why did Lewis love this so much? And he tells us, it's in a ton of his writing. So I focus particularly in this talk on four things. The Spenser's sense of pageantry, the relationship that Spenser draws between the masculine, the feminine, and fertility, the overt goal of creating a sense of joy, and then his method of creating unity through the milieu. And I tried to show in this paper how actually all of those are also present in Lewis. Lewis, I think, is gaining a sense of he gets these qualities from Spenser. And this is the sense in which it's really clear to say Spenser was a major influence on Lewis. I mentioned earlier, I disagree with some of the previous folks who've written about this connection. The only examples I could find tried to draw a one-to-one correspondence between characters. This character in book 1 of The Fairy Queen is Jadis, or this character in book 2 is Malgrim the Wolf. I just think that's patently nonsense. Lewis is not that simple, but he does get from Spenser a real attention for pageantry. Spenser has this attention to displaying these different virtues and vices and sins and habits throughout the Fairy Queen, and he wants us to see those. And they're all symbolically significant. Everything they're wearing is symbolic. The colors they're attached to are symbolic. Lewis does a lot of the same thing. And this is, I think this becomes helpful to understand, like, for example, in Prince Caspian, why exactly is Aslan, like, walking around collecting creatures and liberating schoolboys and school teachers? Well, he's creating a pageant of joy that's showing the liberation that he brings from false rule. And Lewis is wanting to show that. In the same way, I think that's a helpful way to understand what exactly is Father Christmas doing in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's a pageant moment where Lewis isn't really wanting us to see that as a narrative moment. You could cut out Father Christmas and find some other more plot-based way to get Peter, the High King, his sword, and Susan, her horn. But Lewis wants us to see that pageant. I think he gets that sense of the scene, the pageant moment from Spenser. Similarly, Spenser has this deep concern for the connection between the masculine, the feminine, and then the creation of new life. And Lewis, too, has a lot of those same elements. I'll leave that to your discretion on your show if you want me to go into detail, but I did read you probably have to actually look at the poetry to get it, but I read a pretty racy bit of erotic poetry in that poem. But I'll let you tell me if you want me to come back to that. But part of what Spenser is always doing is he's taking his readers into real darkness, but then he's showing the triumph of virtue and the triumph of the good and the triumph of the knight and really the triumph of the struggle. And it's never a simplistic triumph. It's not as easy as the good guy always wins. But what he's showing in that the joy that is found in living well. And he's doing what is almost impossible. I mean, that Aristotle goes to great lengths to talk about just how good, virtuous happiness is. It is so difficult to show that in a story. The good guys are almost always boring. And Spenser is trying to show, actually, there is a great complexity and a great joy here. And Lewis, I think, tries to do the same. He's wanting to show us the goodness of Tyrion as the king at the end of all things, who refuses to give in to this lie. And he crafts a story where we come along with Tyrion and we see just how much easier it would be to go along with Shift, and yet how grateful we are that Tyrion is fighting even to the death for defending Aslan. And he shows us the goodness and the joy of courage in that moment. Lastly, Spenser's really tricky to understand. The Fairy Queen doesn't really work as a sequential set of stories. Each book is kind of independent. The characters eventually connect, but part of Spenser's complexity is he doesn't really tell you anybody's name until he's had them be speaking for 5 or 6 pages. And so you might have a character from 80 pages ago who's back, but you don't know that that's that character. So the unity of these stories is created through the setting. And I think that too is something that Lewis does, particularly with Narnia, because he's got 7 very different stories that are happening, and he's intentionally not trying to repeat the same style of story. He even at one point in one of his essays, he talks about wanting to tell a pirate story, and that's where Don Treader came in. He wanted the boys' adventure tale. But the things that link these stories together are always the setting of the world of Narnia. And I think Lewis gets that sense of you can use the place and the feeling of that place to hold these disparate stories together. He's not doing what Tolkien did. Like Tolkien unified all these stories through writing history and languages. Lewis, honestly, I don't think Lewis cares that much about the inner consistency of reality for Narnia. Instead, he wants the feeling of Narnia to hold together Shasta's journey from Calormen and encountering Aslan on the mountain as he's like almost falling off the cliff, to Lucy sailing with Reepicheep through like the white flowers and then letting Reepicheep keep going. Like it's the feeling of that place that holds all these together. So that's what I tried to argue in this paper, that there are some specific things that Lewis gets from Spenser, and that if we read Spenser, we actually do gain a better understanding of Lewis, because we'll understand what Lewis appreciated about Spenser.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. When you were talking earlier about people trying to pick out, well, it's just this character re-imported. That's far too simplistic. From everything that you've said, it puts me in mind of the Kappa element of romance, where Lewis talks about the feeling, the environment that you are in. And although Lewis doesn't go to great lengths for the verisimilitude of Tolkien, each of his books has a very distinct feeling, and it's one that you can sort of dive into and lose yourself. And I would say that the same is true for the Fairy Queen. It's a story that you can lose yourself in more than one sense. And I actually even wonder if that might be what he meant when he spoke about how Spenser can be good for your mind, and good for your mental health, because you were just disappearing into a world for a while and forgetting the self.
I think that's true. And at the same time, it's worth keeping in mind that I think I said a minute ago that Lewis is not doing what Tolkien's doing. There is one part of Tolkien's essay on fairy stories that comes to mind there, where I think Lewis actually is doing what Tolkien's describing, where Tolkien responds to the charge of fantasy as escapism. And he says, oh, well, actually, for starters, why would you ever deny the prisoner the imagination that can imagine freedom? But also, it's not really escapism, because good fantasy is real. I think that's where Spenser also is really, really helpful, and particularly helpful, I think, to us today, because Spenser has that really strong poetic insight. Like the heart of the poet is not really the ability to rhyme or the ability to think in 12-syllable dodecahedron, whatever there's a word for it.
There's a reason I do haikus. Simpler structure.
Yep. Dactylic hexameter. That's the phrase I was looking for, that like Homer wrote in dactylic hexameter. That's not really the heart of the poet. The heart of the poet is being able to see the connection between seemingly different things. And by immersing yourself in good poetry, you really become better equipped to see the wholeness of the world. And that mental illness, and I'm speculating, Lewis doesn't directly say this, but I suspect, mostly from what he does in Abolition of Man, that Lewis would connect that sense of mental illness to really failing to rightly understand reality. And so what moves us towards a position of mental health is actually understanding the real and understanding it correctly. And that in turn, so when we read poetry like Spenser, who shows us the necessary connections between suffering and holiness, the possible temptation to leave the one true church and be tempted by the seductress Duessa, the second church, the false second church, and the potential of magic from Archimago to come up with all kinds of illusions that distract us from reality. All of those things point us back to truth, and they point us back to reality. And in doing so, they give us minds that are much more attuned to understand the real. And so I suspect that's part of what Lewis loved about Spenser, and it's what he's also trying to do in his own work. He wants to take the reader through this story and help the reader see reality more truly through the story.
Yeah, that makes sense. Recently, I've been going on a Charles Williams dive, and one of the things that I'm taking from him is the sort of interconnectedness and layering of everything. I mean, I think he had some bonkers ideas, but he had this idea of reality as a cohesive whole. I managed to dig out the quotation. So it's in Studies in Medieval and Renaissance Literature. He says, "This kind of poetry, if receptively read, has psychotherapeutic powers." The other thing in what you said that resonated with me was the pageantry and the kind of the romance, the knight errant, because we're actually experiencing that at the moment with Perelandra. You know, when Ransom comes to Perelandra, it's underscored again and again and again about the heraldic colors of everything, and about this enacting of a myth. And Ransom in the first book, and we're in the second book, and I'm not going to tell the listeners what happens in the third book because we're technically not there yet. But he is always this sort of knightly figure who is on a quest, and it's in the process of that quest, as he is pursuing his adventure, that he himself is changed and becomes a better man as a result.
Now, in the Fairy Queen, the purest knight errant character is Prince Arthur. Which that totally threw me for a loop when I first read. I was like, Prince Arthur? Who writes about Prince Arthur? He's king as soon as he draws that sword, but not for Spenser. He has Prince Arthur questing for Gloriana, and I'm like, where's Guinevere? There's no Guinevere here. It's Gloriana instead. But that's exactly what Arthur is supposed to have happen to him, that same sort of transformation. Because he always shows up, and he's simultaneously himself realizing the virtues that are potential within him, but he's also the example of those virtues in each of the episodes where he shows up. So he's both this human character in the story that's changing, but also he is the moral standard that is the exemplar. So I think that's exactly right about what Lewis is doing with Ransom and Perelandra, and it's. It also totally sets up the battle between him and Unman, which is just so. Every time I read that, I'm just like, okay, I have not done this. I don't hope to do this, but there are definitely people I've spoken with. I'm like, we have reached the limits of rational discourse. And I'm not really going to, in this world, in this fallen world, I am not capable of exercising that anger the way it's supposed to be. But I look at that moment of like, I think Lewis, too, had to have had some conversations where he's like, we're done. There's nowhere else that words can get us. Like, it's just left to fisticuffs now.
Yeah, we'll be getting to that in, I think, probably about a month, that particular scene. But if ever I was disputing with a philosopher who said his favorite book was Perelandra, I'd be very careful what I said, just in case. This has been wonderful. I am definitely getting you back at the end of this season on the audio podcast so we can talk through Lewis and gender and what the heck is going on. But sure. What would you suggest is the best way for someone to begin Spenser if they haven't already?
I'll just reference. I don't remember. I don't have it on hand, like which essay, but in one of his many introductions that he wrote, Lewis answered this question. And he suggested that he was writing specifically to younger readers, start with a great introduction or a great illustrated edition. I think that is probably the best place for younger readers to start, or honestly, for adults who just feel intimidated by large blocks of poetry that's written in rather archaic and intimidating spelling language. This same question came up after I read this paper at the conference, and I'll try and repeat the same advice I gave then. If you do go for kind of a standard edition, I'll hold this one up one more time. This is the current scholarly edition, and it's edited by Hiroshi Yamashita, A.C. Hamilton, Suzuki, and Fukuda. I'm really not sure why, but there is an enormous Japanese Spenser connection. And I really think there's something interesting there that I'd like to dig into at some point. Be like, why on earth of all places, why are there a bunch of scholars in Japan that are like, we are going to be the guys for Edmund Spenser? But they are.
It's kind of anime. It's all about rip-roaring
You know,
adventures and kind of hard to follow at times.
it would make an amazing anime series, honestly. Like, that would be awesome. I would love to see the anime version of the Giant of Pride. Like, that would be amazing. That might be the perfect medium for this poem. If you do try to read the real Spenser, if you have any part of you that's like, I want the raw, difficult stuff, I would just encourage you to with three things. Trust your innate grasp of what these words are. Don't be thrown by the fact that there is no standardized spelling. Standardized spelling develops over time, and it's tied to publishing norms. None of those exist in Spenser's day. So words are spelled in all kinds of creative ways.
I would appreciate that.
None of that existed when I was a kid failing spelling tests. that just didn't happen. Second thing is really just to trust Spenser. Because what happens when you read Spenser, I think, is the same thing that happens if you read Shakespeare. Initially, people read Shakespeare if they've not read him before, and they think, oh my goodness, I need secondary help. I need some kind of apparatus. But honestly, if you just read Shakespeare and you stick with it, eventually the story starts making sense. You start to grasp the characters, and you can see it all. The same thing happens with Spenser. The other thing is just know that each of these books is supposed to be allegorical. So, but it's a different kind of allegory. I think when we typically come to allegory, we're usually expecting something like John Bunyan. Pilgrim is the good guy. Mr. Worldly Wise is a bad guy. Faithful is clearly a good guy, and so on. Spenser doesn't do that. Every figure in here is allegorical. They mean something more than themselves, but they're also real characters that make real choices. And Spenser weaves that together in a far more complex way, I think, than Bunyan does. So really know what you're reading and trust the author and just give it time. And it's really well worth the effort, I think.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
If you leave this in, the edited version, I'll use your show to shamelessly plug the fact that I'm currently trying an experiment. I run a certificate program through Thales College. We call it the Certificate in Classical Education Philosophy. And I'm currently trying to see if any of the people doing that certificate program would want to read the Ransom trilogy together in a kind of an extra class. So if anybody listening to this or anybody watching this show is like, hey, I would love to read the Ransom trilogy in a class format that provides a bit more structure and just the accountability of other people having read stuff on a schedule, please do feel free to drop me an email. You can find me at josh.herring@thalescollege.org and would love to connect with anybody that's like, hey, I'm interested. Give me more details about a class that's going to help me read the Ransom trilogy over this coming summer in 2025.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and filling me in what I missed, because for whatever from one place thus fall is with the tide to another brought, for there is nothing lost that may be found if sought. And viewers, please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.
Cheers.